Okay, I guess I'll start. Number one, it is raining. I have often wondered about spaces and places, the built places we inhabit or pass through every day, or on designated occasions. And I have been struck by how places seem to outdo the functions and the roles assigned to them, the very functions that would validate their existence. The built environment is of our making. It houses us in the same way that we might think of language as the house of being. But just like language, places don't belong to us. They are not us, let's say. They are non-human entities with their own agendas. And so a gap always remains between what places are for us, and what places are, or might be, or have been. I've often wondered, as I'm wondering now, what is this room for? What is it doing? What is this, a theatre? I might understand its assigned use or function, but something else is at work here, and it has to do with the actual material existence of things and processes, whether visible or invisible, nameable or unnameable. It has something to do with what we might call for now non-human agency. Something is occurring here in this room, alongside, beside, behind, or in the middle of the main event. Alongside, behind, or in the middle of speech, of moving bodies. Other entities have a capacity to act, to affect, to do, to undo, to endure time, or even to think. Non-human agency tends to be minimized. It gets considered and consigned to the background. The foreground is where the main action happens. The reason for there being a theatre is the primary event, the labour of human performers and spectators, and the less visible labour of personnel. But always and always already the background is there, or rather it is here. A background, a dramaturgy of the room itself, beginning with the floor, the walls, the ceilings, the seats, the curtains, the drapes, the electrical wires. These elements are here and something is happening. We could think of it through the way we refer colloquially to weather events. For example, when we say, "It is raining," the pronoun "it" refers to no one or nothing in particular. It acts as a sign signaling a vacancy of sorts, a kind of conceptual impasse. When it rains, nothing in particular rains. The sky doesn't rain, the clouds don't rain, the rain doesn't rain, and yet it rains. Or we could borrow from political theorist Jane Bennett, who describes this agency as a force that, though quite real and powerful, is intrinsically resistant to representation. So, how to make this force manifest? How to report on this indoor weather? We could perhaps chart the backstories of these entities, where things come from, perhaps a forest for the wood, perhaps a stone quarry for the walls, perhaps cotton fields for the chairs that you're sitting on. Large-scale processes of deforestation, extraction, exploitation, species loss are all around us right now. They are, in fact, enabling us to be in this room together right now, addressing these very processes. I will leave these backstories for now to try and veer more towards the non-human material presence of the room, the theatre, the place, and the question of how to engage with it, if that's at all possible. What I am stunned by, again and again, what I am stunned by are things and beings, and the quandary of relation across species, across kingdoms, between the animate and the inanimate. What the post-human theorist Jeffrey Jerome Cohen has called cross-ontological affinities. So dust particles, air currents, bacterial, microbial happenings, insects, vegetal life, these are what make the news. The background has gate-crashed into the foreground, or rather, it has been there all along. This is the Anthropocene, where we discover that fast distinctions between here and there, inside and outside, were never tenable. Still, language and thinking habits, the architectural, social and bodily structures of theatres all tend to background the non-human. We repress the place unless functionality is involved. So what happens if we suspend functionality? How can this room be allowed to be something else, an event in its own right? How to access other modes of existence. Cambridge, 15th of January 2018. The Brussels event is in 2 weeks' time, and I have barely written my presentation. An increasingly bad habit of writing and preparing on the fly a few days before, hours before, as I get there, on the train, in the hotel room, whilst asleep. Then I remember that Nicolaus Ganserer will be writing in the moment on the day itself. So this makes me relax a little bit. Right now I'm sitting on a slow-moving bus here in Cambridge, a city that is entirely new to me. I am thinking about the title of the event in Brussels, on enclosed spaces and the great outdoors. I probably shouldn't focus too much on the words of the title, but I can't help it, they lock themselves in my mind. I look outside, it's raining. I see an advertising sign at a bus stop from a company that manages outdoor advertising space. It reads, "Advertise here." This is a sign advertising a space for an advertising sign, a kind of stand-in for an advert to come. I take a quick picture of the poster with my phone, and I begin to imagine a city in which every object, surface and entity is covered with signs advertising their function or purpose. Signs advertising "lean on this," for instance, hanging on every wall. Signs advertising "sit here," stuck on every bench or cafe chair. Or "stand here" on every pavement and road. "Breathe here" on every tree. A few days later, I'm scrolling through the photographs on my phone, and I open the one of the Cambridge bus stop, simply in order to delete it, to get rid of it, when something in the photograph, in the sign, catches my attention. It's the company's motto at the bottom, which you might not be able to see here. It reads, "Delivering the great outdoors." I go online to see if the company Wise Media have a website. They do. Or rather, they have a website advertising the fact that there will soon be a website. 2. Il cielo in una stanza. The sky in a room. Let's consider this room, this theatre, not necessarily this particular one, which is completely unknown to me, but this theatre as a model, what is known in architectural history as théâtre à l'italienne, the neoclassical theatre. This is a theatre as enclosure, as a bound, enclosed space, and yet it is also a device capable of delivering the great outdoors. Historically, the fact of theatre being a room, small or large, is very recent. Yeah? It starts in the early Renaissance, and a possible progenitor is the Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza, a somewhat anomalous construction built to simulate the Greek-Roman amphitheatre, except that this one, the one in Vicenza, is indoors. This is effectively the first modern theatre, 16th century, and it's already a sign, it's a representation of a theatre. It is still intact, although today it mostly functions as a tourist destination, a kind of museum theatre, let's say. The stage, which you can't see here, but the stage features a permanent kind of stage set from the first production, which happened in the late 16th century. So there are three-dimensional archways and illusory street perspectives of an idealized version of Vicenza. The seating resembles a Greek-Roman auditorium, and there is a portico at the back. The ceiling of the Teatro Olimpico is painted with images of a blue sky and clouds. I visited the Olimpico a few years ago rather casually, and I remember gazing up at the sky-painted ceiling and humming a tune to myself before even realizing that what I was singing was a famous Italian pop song from the 60s, Il cielo in una stanza, literally the sky inside a room. I can't sing very well, but Quando sei qui con me, questa stanza non ha più pareti ma alberi, alberi infiniti. Quando sei qui vicino a me, questo soffitto viola no, non esiste più. Io vedo il cielo sopra noi che restiamo qui, abbandonati come se non ci fosse più. It's a fantasy of a room collapsing, opening ecstatically to the elements, to the great outdoors, to nature as it exists surely beyond this room. Now, at the risk of hyperbole, of exaggeration, the song and the space of the Olimpico seem to capture something fundamental about Western theatre as a place and the relation between indoors and outdoors. Let's see. So, refocusing on the ceiling, I wonder what the purpose of the Olimpico's sky, this sky, might be, other than its functional allusion to the outdoors. It's an idealized sky of sorts, and it clearly manifests itself as a sign. Yeah? It's as though it featured the words, "This is not a sky," written between the clouds. This is the space where the sky would be if this were a real Greek-Roman theatre. So this simulacrum of idealized clouds and blue sky produces a certain idea of nature, this great thing that is supposedly out there. And so in a sense, the sign is blocking off the real thing. The sky ceiling is replacing the original. We might think of a sign as a simple layer, something that is separating us momentarily from the real thing behind it. And surely if we break the walls of the theatre, we let in the real world. Enough of these artificial constructions. I want real air and sunshine, clouds and rain. But the walls of the enclosed theatre don't peel off to reveal a world on the other side. Images only yield more images. Painted clouds beneath painted clouds beneath painted clouds. And if we exit and step outside, this nature ceases to exist. Because the idealized blue sky produced in the Olimpico requires the enclosed space of the theatre in order to exist. So, to return to the words of the title of this event, theatre is the enclosed space that delivers the great outdoors as idealized scenario. Theatre is a space not of reflection of the real world, but its production. It is here in the theatre that we rehearse a longing for the real thing, for that which isn't theatre, for that which isn't a cultural fabrication. The painted ceiling makes the sky. The room produces the world. The invention of the indoors coincides with the invention of the outdoors. Simply put, nature is a cultural construction, and it was constructed inside a theatre. That's the end of my hyperbole. As a short footnote, I might briefly add this: it wasn't only nature that was constructed inside a theatre. The modern subject too, this entity believing itself to be autonomous, self-present, capable of surveying an intelligible world of signs. This too was made inside the walls of the theatre. Theatre is not a place for spectacle, but a factory for producing idealized nature and the modern subject. End of footnote. Okay, so if we take this arrangement of inside and outside, nature and culture, science and reality, how do we approach non-human agency, this force of things that resists representation? Signs are, after all, also things. And so I wonder how this theatre, whether it's the Olimpico or the Kai building, or more in general the Western apparatus of representation, with all the aesthetic and dramaturgical modifications of the 20th century, how might it become a site for experimenting with agencies that are not human in a paradigm that we might call ecocentric as opposed to anthropocentric? Three, abandoned. I look for answers to theatrical questions, often in related art forms. For instance, in the 2016 film Homo Sapiens by Nicolaus Gehiralto, a different Nicolaus. The film is entirely comprised of a series of static shots of empty, usually abandoned places, suggestive of a human species which has suddenly disappeared or fled. As spectators, we're given plenty of time to simply observe the remains, a background left to disintegrate and transform, collapsed built structures and other objects, enduring in otherwise uneventful settings. It is significant for this that the film begins and it ends in the same enclosed theatre. A space shown to be filled with snow, gusts of wind, and the sound of rain droplets falling into water puddles. With great pathos, the film announces the start and end of human civilization, as always cited within the theatre, this apparatus, this enclosure in which the world is walled off so that it can be known as a sign. Now, at first glance, the film to me, seems to embrace what might be an ecocentric regime of attention. It challenges us to engage with non-human actors over long stretches of time. A slow film that can only work if the viewer experiments with decentering the place accorded to humans. We have to, in a sense, undo anthropocentric hierarchies of beings and phenomena. However, as I keep watching, it becomes obvious that despite no humans being visible in this film, this is a work entirely about the species mentioned in the film's title. The empty structures, the buildings, and the rooms filmed by Geralter are not there to shift attention away from, but squarely back onto Homo sapiens. Abandoned places functions like discarded clothing. These artifacts sing humankind, they lament its loss. The director has stated himself that this is a film about human beings. And so although it films empty places, it only engages with what places are for, not what they are or what they might be. Though it might appear that attention is given to the background, to material non-human agency, to an immanent force that resists representation, in fact, all we find is ourselves, always ourselves, always. What is this impasse about? I am disappointed, of course, not in the artwork. Rather, I am disappointed that I cannot appropriate the artwork for my own ecological project. And I am disappointed because I thought that if we remove the human presence, it would be easy to track the unsettling presence of non-human actors. The problem, I now realize, has to do with the relation of inside and outside, the nature-culture binary. The juxtaposition of snow, let's say, and an indoor theatre, or a fairground ride, and the sea, works by powering up, effectively, the nature-culture binary. These images are pleasing or startling precisely to the extent that they announce a breach of distinct domains, culture and nature. And although they come together, conceptually the binary is reinforced and celebrated. I think the context for this kind of operation is a marked trend, certainly in the UK anyway, for photographs of ruined and abandoned places, often collected in coffee table books as a kind of sort of glossy fetish or commodity. Even the imaged demise of civilization can be claimed by capital. It is no surprise, perhaps. Hollywood action blockbusters pump the adrenaline through natural disasters, floods linked to climate change, and battles for earthly survival. These artistic coffee table book photographs of abandoned places are essentially tapping into the quieter end of that same market. And yet part of me can't let go. The empty place still seems so close to that background dramaturgy. Brussels, 9th of February 2018. It's not going well. The film I thought I could analyze and champion, it turns out, is just a mirror to ourselves. It won't do. On the way here to Brussels, I pick up an EasyJet in-flight magazine, which is a magazine for the get-up-and-go generation. I turn to a feature called Lost Worlds. A legion of forgotten buildings across Europe are being reclaimed by nature, lending them an otherworldly kind of beauty. The images show an abandoned Italian palazzo, a factory. Oh, this isn't a factory, this is a fun fair. This is another villa. This is a factory. The photographs are sandwiched between much larger clothes adverts. One for men and one for women. A gentleman makes it happen is the one for men, and bring out your Latin bombshell is the one for women. The message here, the admonishment that's coming across from the magazine through the pairing of these photographs of abandoned spaces and the clothing adverts is this: you either accept the violent reinstatement of social roles and clearly defined gender identities, or else we face the demise of civilization. It is as though these images of ruined, abandoned places perform a violent discursive act. They put apocalyptic thinking at the service of social and political conservatism. They make us imagine the end to better force dominant relations of power based on capital. Upon arriving at Brussels, I realized that I've learned a lot from the EasyJet magazine, and that is to not get attached to non-human emptiness, to not cling to that Zen nothing, and to not overly romanticize the agency of things outside of human control. I am reminded once again by EasyJet that it might be precisely when we absent the figure of the human, that we most forcefully place it center stage. Oh yeah, great. There's the proof. Four, conclusion. This is not a conclusion. I mostly chose the word conclusion for this last section because of its etymology, its closeness with theatre. To definitely enclose. And also because of that sense of how the conceptual apparatus of the modern subject, formed with the theatre, seems inadequate in facing the Anthropocene. Beginning with the fact that theatre cannot be a conclusion or a definitely enclosed space, time, or event. It's not an enclosure. Bruno Latour's famous formulation, we have never been modern, we have never been a modern subject, we have never been an ideal human subject, autonomous and so on. It can be altered to fit this purpose. We have never been enclosed. And because we have never been enclosed, it makes little sense to speak of letting nature in, or making room for the non-human, let alone the popular obsession with nature reclaiming spaces. The discrete separations between human and animal, inside and outside, or nature and culture no longer work because they never have. It is the burden of the 21st century that we are finding this out too late, in a condition which we're choosing to call the Anthropocene, which announces an irrevocable shift away from the relatively stable ecologies of the Holocene. Today, the field of nature and that of culture are being shown to be often violently inseparable, intertwined, usually because of anthropogenic activities. The example that comes to mind are the photographs, quite famous, of decomposed seagulls by Chris Jordan. with the Anthropocene, there is a strange and paradoxical relation of containing and being contained, the inside in the outside in the inside. It's a situation in which the larger Russian doll is contained inside the smaller one. So for example, if you think of plastic, which is used as a container for liquids, for mineral water, fizzy drinks, etc. Now plastic bottle parts, particularly bottle caps, the tops of bottles, have been shown, such as in these photographs by Chris Jordan. They find their way inside the bodies of seagulls and other marine birds who take the pieces of plastic for food. They feed the bottle tops to their young, and they eventually die of suffocation. The images clearly show a strange body of plastic, not organs, but lighters, bottle tops, and other debris. What is perhaps more disconcerting, because it affects us, is the extent to which plastic makes its way into our bodies, through the fish that we eat, for example, since fish are now eating the microplastics in the sea, the broken down plastic that floats there like a new element in the atmosphere. And of course in the water we drink, tap water, no matter how much we filter it, no matter how much we are ecologically aware, is likely to contain microplastics. The images of the seagulls are an image of our own bodies. This is the interconnectedness of the Anthropocene. It's a strange, toxic version of the interrelation between all beings. Everything is indeed connected, equally polluted, marked indefinitely and at every scale by the extraction of fossil fuel and the production of plastic. Our bodies end up acting as containers, not just of foods, but of our food's containers. Time scales, spatial scales are undone. We are in uncharted waters. As the scientists behind the Anthropocene are very fond of saying, there is no analog state for where we're at. This is the Anthropocene as avant-garde, since the avant-garde was characterized by pushing into the unknown, by breaking with traditional forms to reach a terra incognita. As the scientist Paul Crutzen, who invented the term Anthropocene, wrote, human activities have become so pervasive and profound that they rival the great forces of nature and are pushing the Earth as a whole into planetary terra incognita. The so-called rules of the game are being broken not by artist collectives, by geniuses, by innovators, but by the unforeseeable consequences of anthropogenic ecocide. The avant-garde is geological, atmospheric, medical, environmental. Thank you. I don't know how many of these terms are sort of common currency over here, and how much the abandoned places is a common currency. In the UK there's this real tendency towards what we call ruin lust, or even ruin porn. It's a big phenomenon which kind of says a lot about how even empty spaces can get claimed by capital. Perhaps we can continue a moment with Nikolaus and with any comments or questions, anything at all that people might have. I can sing. One thing I haven't spoken about, which is happening right now in Cardiff, in an art gallery in Wales. I was going to make the presentation loop back to the song, but I didn't get there in time. I can improvise now. This is a piece by Ragnar Kjartansson, visual artist, and it's just opened in the art centre in Cardiff. It's the 18th century room for paintings, and he's removed all the paintings. And the room also features this organ, this very beautiful organ. Now, the song that I was singing, Il cielo in una stanza, a bit later on in the lyrics, features the way in which a small harmonica, sounds like an organ, like a big organ. And it's curious because the artist here has chosen as a performance to have organ players and singers play the Gino Paoli song on a loop all day, every day, I think for 3 months. And so as a visitor to the gallery, as a visitor to the 18th century painting room, you'll find that the paintings are no longer there, but what you will find is this looped song, which is announcing, if you like, this room that opens up to the sky, to the blue sky, to the great outdoors. And I think maybe in some respect, this strikes me as a much better way of reaching the great outdoors than this obsession with abandoned places, with ruination. I find this quite comforting, I guess. It says something about the conceptual impasse of the Anthropocene and sort of staying with it as opposed to trying to resolve it, kind of. How can we rehearse staying with this impasse?
No questions?
Yeah, maybe.
Yeah.
Could you say a word about your book? And for the reason I know, I think you study different theater in basic history. Just know a bit what are your study cases.
Yeah, no, sure. Without advertising it too much, but it's impossible, I guess. Yeah, so I focused on four theatre buildings for the book. One is the Teatro Olimpico in Vicenza. One is the Teatro Amazonas in Brazil, in the Amazon jungle, which opens the film Fitzcarraldo by Herzog. One is the Opera House in Munich, and one is a musical theatre that was demolished in London, in the East End of London. And the project really is trying to figure out what happens inside these theatres when nothing happens. So it's kind of trying to do that thing of shifting the perspective away from performances in the sense of human shows. And so I don't mention any artistic work, I guess. There aren't any allusions to performances as such. It's really trying to map out what the buildings themselves are doing. And so, for example, in the case of the Teatro Olimpico with its sky, what happened on my visit, which I didn't mention, of course, is that a swallow flew inside the theatre, a small bird, migratory bird, the European swallow. It flew inside the Olimpico, so you had this strange effect of this swallow flying underneath the sky. And the chapter in the book is pretty much an attempt at trying to understand how the presence of what kind of modes of habitation does it invite. The other theatres are different, so the Teatro Amazonas has a very interesting history of being abandoned for most of the 20th century, being reclaimed a little bit by termites, being put to very different uses. Teatro Amazonas, this beautiful opera house right in the middle of the Amazon, was used, for example, for storing rubber, the rubber that was powering the Industrial Revolution around Europe and the US in the 20th century. Yeah. And it's available on Amazon and other places.
the last picture that you showed before me, the last one, that's about your vision from your room.
Oh yeah, this is this morning at the Atlas Hotel in the center of Brussels. The sky outside. Yeah. Yeah, I guess researching for this event, I sort of realized something about how, and I think that's why I prefer this. I realized something just about how the depiction of the attempt to access the non-human, to kind of say, look, here it is, we've accessed it, here it is, a picture, look, you can touch it, you can feel it, not like a theatre where it's all artificial. No, this is, that whole, if you like, discursive apparatus is predicated on this separation of nature and culture, so it ends up kind of failing, I think. It ends up undoing the very thing that you're trying to do, which is to kind of get away from, if you like, an anthropocentric perspective. I often find this desire to get away from the human reinforces the human. This is a kind of, I'm not a philosopher, but I get this from having read some of Derrida's project on trying to get away from metaphysics. Often it's the very gesture of trying to leave that reproduces a metaphysical apparatus. And I guess in a similar kind of way, the attempt at reaching nature is reproducing the very apparatus that created this idea of nature in the first place. And so we can never get there. Which is, I guess, why a lot of the contemporary ecologists like Timothy Morton talk about this idea that we can have ecology without nature, or that nature is an idea that we need to get rid of if we want to kind of live a more environmental life. Which is, of course, very tricky because most environmentalists are fighting for nature. So we're in this kind of weird deadlock position. We're in another conceptual impasse where if you care for nature, well, then philosophically there's a big misstep kind of in the works. Yeah. If that makes sense. Oh yeah.
In your research about these theater buildings, did you also look into the renovation of old, like Italian, how they renovated?
Like when they get used for other purposes?
I'm curious because one thing I noticed is that often there's an attempt to put more glass in the facade, for example, to I guess, to create a more permeable theater.
Yeah.
So I was wondering.
Yeah. I mean, although I focus on those four, I do mention and look at some others, and there's some really interesting historical examples, like the Residenztheater in Munich is a fascinating one, because I don't know if you know, but this was a theatre that in 1944, so when Munich was being bombed, the city decided that because it's such a beautiful Baroque opera house, perfectly preserved, what they decided to do was to dismantle the whole interior of the theatre, and they did that. So they literally took down the balconies, the seats, and they hid it outside of Munich. And it stayed there for years. The theatre was packed away, if you like, and then, I can't remember now the exact dates, but I think it's around in the 1950s, they took the pieces out, and they put them back together, and they sort of rebuilt this theatre. In between, a bomb did fall where the theatre was. And so you've got this weird story whereby a bomb effectively fell on the theatre, but the theatre is perfectly intact. As if somehow the theatre could, or the Théâtre Italien is so strong that it can just win against a bomb, against material destruction. And the funny thing is that if you visit this theatre, you don't know this history, so it looks as if nothing's happened. It looks as if this theatre is perfectly preserved. It looks as if history hasn't happened, and all of that. So I kind of look at that question of preservation, maintenance, and how preservation and maintenance can conspire, I guess, with ideologies that erase certain historical processes. And there are other examples, like the English theatre director Peter Brook quite famously found a theatre in the north of Paris, like a disused musical theatre, and he decided to use it as the main site for his company for 30 years or so, Le Bouffe du Nord, in the north of Paris. But what he did was, instead of, if you like, glossing the theatre, because it was a beautiful musical theatre, instead of restoring it and bringing it back as if somehow we'd gone back in time, he decided to kind of leave it distressed. So all the plaster peeling off, you know, of course safe, but essentially if you see photographs of the space, it looks, you know, the walls are kind of, you can see the age of the building, you know. It's weathered, that's the word we'd use in English. And so you might think, oh, that's great, that's much better than pretending that we can go back in time to a perfectly preserved theatre. But something odd that happened a few years after that was he was asked by a theatre impresario in New York to stage a piece, and to do that in an old theatre that they'd found. And what they decided to do to make the theatre look more authentic, they distressed the theatre. So they began to kind of make it worse, to kind of, you know, make the paint peel off, to ruin the chairs a little bit. And so to produce the impression, a glossy impression of, if you like, a semi-abandoned theatre. And so the glossy and the abandoned end up being almost like equal simulacrums, if you like, or kind of equal processes of fabrication, I guess. So I look at that a little bit, which is quite interesting. This kind of, I had something else to say, but can't remember. Oh yeah.
I don't know about your research learning, but I got introduced to some practices, mainly in Scandinavia, with the use of virtual or extended reality in theaters and to somehow enforce this creation of ecological environments and multi-species technologies in the theater. And I have to be honest that it scares me a bit because I recognize this pattern that you mentioned about just getting back to this really anthropocentric and highly rationalized discourse of representation.
Well, no, it just makes me think, though, of another impasse that the Anthropocene is presenting us with, I think, which is this sense in which many of the major studies by people like Paul Crutzen, this atmospheric chemist who came up with the term Anthropocene, effectively, so a lot of that kind of research is arguably very rational, is arguably very, is very much at the service of a sense of managing the Earth, fixing the Earth system, I guess. And so, whereas the Anthropocene might, on the one hand, kind of open up the possibility for this kind of non-human entanglement, and I think for a genuinely post-humanist, in a very positive sense, like a kind of moving away from the model which created this environmental collapse, moving away from that towards other modes of interspecies relation, other perceptual modes, other modes of inhabitation. I kind of get the impression that much of the mainstream Anthropocenic discourse, which is coming from the sciences, is more interested in essentially a kind of management of the Earth, so it kind of reinforces the amazing power of the human, which it announces. And there's this kind of strange irony at work, I guess, that the moment that we announce environmental collapse is the moment that we name ourselves as people capable of saving it. And by we, of course, I mean it's roughly 500 million people in the world who are responsible for the Anthropocene in the first place, of 7 billion. It's only, 1/14 of the world population that is responsible for greenhouse emissions. You know, most of the world has nothing to do with this as well. So it's again kind of, the colonizers are sort of going, oh my God, the world is wrecked, we must save it. And yeah, it's like, we could be a little bit cynical in a Zizek kind of way of ecology having become almost an opportunity to carry on with business as usual. It's just that instead of calling it discovery and conquer and business, we call it saving the planet, and we call it ecological awareness. That's another impasse that I can't get my head around, and it's not so linked to virtual reality and theatrical explorations, but there's something there, I guess, about the most calculated, rational, managing kind of mind being reinforced precisely at a moment when there is an opportunity to outplay it or to kind of seek for alternatives, I would say.
Thank you, Augusto.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Yeah, cheers.